I'd be okay being if your boss prefers that, then who am I to say
I call him
boss?
my boss. It's just a joke. The camera button is on the bottom left screen, the part of the screen above where
It's
your
on. It
name
turns on.
is.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay, cool.
Excellent.
Hello. All right, there you go.
Hello.
Hey.
Now I can see you. First, I wanted to tell you this is all very informal and casual, so feel very comfortable here with us. We're just having a good conversation. Thank you for coming in the first place. I appreciate you being willing to come and share your ideas with us today.
Sure,
Um,
sure. It's
yes,
a
thank you.
nice
My
initiative
name
here.
yeah, my name is Thomas, and I'm pretty much obsessed with everything that you're obsessed with. So let me give a quick introduction to because this will be later put on YouTube. So I'm going to give an introduction for people of who you are real quick, if that's all right.
Sure.
So I'm going to say Bence, right?
Yeah, Bence.
Bence is a prominent philosopher and cognitive scientist known for his work in the field of aesthetics, philosophy of mind, perception, and other fields. He was born in Budapest, Hungary, and currently holds the position of professor of philosophy and director of the Center for Philosophical Psychology at the University of, is that Antwerp in Belgium?
Yep.
Okay. And so he's written books. We'll call some of those out later, but he is attempting to, let's say, the intersection of philosophy, psychology, aesthetics, and the philosophy of mind. That is his main focus. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. And if you want to, Bence, if you want to bring up anything about your books or any current projects you have, just you're more than welcome to. We're ready to hear it.
Sure. Now? Later?
No.
When?
Well, are you having any future projects or any current projects, like a current book that you're working on or anything, or is there?
I just published a book called Mental
Oh,
Imagery,
okay,
Philosophy, Psychology, and Neuroscience. So that was published in the UK in late April, and it's coming out in the US in next week, actually, in a week. And it's
excellent.
with Oxford University Press. It's very thick, and I've been working on that for like 10 years. So go get it. It's a lot of
Absolutely, yeah.
philosophy.
Anybody watching the video, please go get it.
There's a lot of philosophy in it, a lot of psychology, and a lot of neuroscience. So let's trying to bring
Yes,
all these things together.
that's what I want. I want the interdisciplinary connection of those three empirical philosophies.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And what I'm working now, I'm working on a number of things. Maybe I'm just going to mention one, and that's a trade book. So a book that's not for academic audiences, but for a general audience, and that's coming out with W.W. Norton, and it's going to be called The Fragmented Mind. So that's more of a beach reading kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah, I'm very interested in pragmatism and how it affects every field of philosophy and how it informs us about science as well. I guess I could start asking you like things like instead. I mean, if we want to get into a part of a book, we can. But I was more or less going to ask you about um, the theory of perceptual content. You know.
Sure. You can ask me about
Um,
anything, really.
oh yeah, I know. You seem like a really cool person. So, what about? Let's see. What about our perceptual experiences are highly rich and informative? And can you explain that a bit of it? Just how you think about all that.
How I think about perceptual experiences and the content. So,
Yeah, yeah.
so I'm interested in perceptual experiences because that much of what we care about are perceptual experiences. When we watch a movie, that's some visual and also auditory experience. When we listen to music, that's an auditory experience that we care about a lot. Or when we're eating food, that's also experiences that we care about a lot. So I'm interested in experiences, but I'm also interested. What I'm really interested in is perceptual states in general. So perceptual states can be conscious or unconscious. When they're conscious, we call them perceptual experiences. When they're unconscious, then we don't call them anything. Well, I think, and this is a fairly important thing, I think about explaining the mind, that if we can, we should try to explain the mind in a way that we're not really kind of not obsessed with consciousness, because I think that the main question is how the mind works and not how the conscious mind works. Perception can be conscious or unconscious. We've known that for a long time, and I guess I'm interested in those aspects of perception that's true for conscious and unconscious perception.
Yeah. So unconscious perception would be like our perception of dreams, or our perception of states of how would that work?
No, so dreams are. I mean, it depends on whether you're remember them and stuff. But no, I would say that might be an example of conscious experience, especially lucid dreaming. I don't know whether anyone in the crowd is doing lucid dreaming or has done lucid dreaming.
I've actually done lucid dreaming before, so I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, it's a weird experience. No, what I mean is those kinds of that happens it's very easy to induce that in experimental conditions. So if I present you to some very, very brief stimulus that's shorter than 100 milliseconds, so shorter than 1/10 of a second, then you're not going to know that I presented you something. But it will still influence your behavior. So it's going to prime you, which is like a technical term for the phenomenon that if I show you like a quick picture of a cat, then you're going to be much quicker in the next 5 minutes recognizing cats, but also recognizing, cat-related stimuli like, I don't know, whiskers or meow sounds and stuff like that. So that's called unconscious priming, and that's one of the big research topics in unconscious perception. So that's one reason to think that perception can be unconscious. Another way in which you can induce unconscious perception, if you present stimulus not briefly, but you mask the stimulus, which just means that you present the stimulus and then immediately after that you present another kind of stimulus that masks the other one, so kind of flushes it from your conscious experience. And that again does priming, so that influences your behavior. So you have seen it, but you don't know that you've seen it. You're unconscious of it. And there's also stuff about how action guiding vision can be unconscious. So that's the experiment that they make you reach for a certain It's usually in kind of in a very dark room, and then they present like a light, and then you're supposed to reach the light source. But then while you're reaching, they actually change the light source to be to the left or to the right, and you're adjusting your movement, but you have no idea that anything has changed. So again, the perceptual state that guides your action must have changed. What it represents must have changed. The spatial location that it represents must have changed. But you have no idea. So these are examples of unconscious perception.
Okay. That makes complete sense. So, and it all deals with priming, I assume, right? That's like the main concept behind unconscious perception.
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay. Well, let's dig into a couple more things here I had to talk about. So let's be generalized, because I made some questions to ask you, and instead of getting super specific, we can use the dialectic to get further there, right? What about the integration of empirical findings, phenomenological findings from cognitive science into philosophical theories or philosophical hypotheses? How do you integrate those?
Yeah, good. So I'm a big believer in trying to combine as many disciplines as you can. So, I mean, I think that the main...
I agree.
Good. If you're thinking about the mind is extremely complex, then it's a good idea to use as many different kinds of methodologies as you possibly can. So, neuroscience is relatively recent, or at least good neuroscience is relatively recent, and a couple of decades. And they have extremely good, very important, very impressive methodologies of trying to figure out what's going on in our brain. Psychology has also, has more than a century-long history, and that gives us all kinds of very interesting results, mainly about our behavior and what our behavior is influenced by. Philosophy of mind, also, that's been with us for millennia, and it's also must have given us some kind of something. So I think what we should be doing is to unify all these things. So back in the 80s, there was this discipline called cognitive science. So I guess we still have it, hopefully. But in the 80s,
Yes.
it was especially popular and kind of even hip.
From what I've read, cognitive science is like the overall intersection of psychology, philosophy, AI, all that kind of stuff. So
Exactly. So cognitive science is supposed to be these various disciplines working together: philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, AI, linguistics,
yes.
robotics, and also cognitive ethology, so some parts of biology. And the idea is that all these disciplines would work together to solve the big puzzles of how the mind works. And that's I very much believe in this endeavor, and I feel that. So I'm a philosopher. That us philosophers have a big role here because you might think that philosophy is the kind of discipline that doesn't really belong. Because what are we bringing to this table, really?
Well, I
Neuroscience
think
has
it does.
incredibly.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said I think it definitely does because it
Oh, so
underpins
do I.
all of
So do
our
I. But one might
understandings.
wonder. One might wonder. No, I mean, I think that that's a genuine word. I wish that more philosophers would be worried about this. What is it that we're contributing, right? Because neuroscience is very impressive and important findings about the brain. Psychology has important, impressive findings of a more kind of behavioral nature. But what is it that's distinctive about what us philosophers of mind bring together? Now, I think that it is very important what we're doing because we're in some ways we're providing the whole kind of shared framework of bringing all these things together. So I think it is very important, but I'm not sure that philosophy is going to give us any kind of data points, if you see what I mean.
No, I
More
get that
like
completely.
integrating network. And so you started with this question about you started when you're asking this question, you were starting with phenomenology and how phenomenology is kind of. I think phenomenology is important, and that's what makes us care about this a certain a certain aspect of the human mind, like I don't know, addiction. That's a big topic, right? Just one random
Yes.
example. We have a lot of really cool neuroscience on it. We have a really cool psychology on that. What does philosophy of mind bring to the table? I mean, you might think that, well, we bring the phenomenology stuff, and that might be okay, and that how it feels to be addicted or something like that. But there's going to be a huge interpersonal variations in any kind of phenomenological data, and also we have an enormous amount of findings about the unreliability of introspection. So I feel that phenomenology is less important
Yeah.
in these
Well,
fields than.
phenomenology includes all of our cognitive biases, right?
Exactly. So we're very much exactly. So very biased to think of ourselves in a good light. Because of that, our phenomenology is very often going to be misleading because we're always trying to kind of make sense of our own experiences in a way that, yeah, I'm right, I was right, or I was justified to have that kind of experience. So yeah, I'm much less trustful of phenomenology than all the other data points. But again, that doesn't mean that that philosophy doesn't have a role here. I think it has
Yeah.
a really central role. In some ways, that's the kind of the center of gravity of the whole interdisciplinary endeavor of trying to understand the mind.
Yeah. So, like cognitive psychology specifically, and neuroscience, neurobiology, are making the oh, damn, I forgot how I was going to put that. They are making the data points, right? Whereas the philosophy of mind cannot by definition make any data points.
I mean, at least not to the same extent, but in some ways, what what we philosophers are doing is as important as providing data point as it is to try to bring this all together. That's another reason why I think philosopher is in a kind of a very different and in some ways more central position than the other disciplines of the empirical
Yeah, I
hodgepodge.
agree. It's foundational, actually.
So in the sense that if I mean, I don't know whether you guys have hung out with empirical scientists. They're very impressive in every kinds of way. But they're
Mm.
also incredibly busy, right? I mean, they have to run. If you're a neuroscientist, you have to run the experiment. You have to run the goddamn fMRI machine and make sure that it's all properly controlled. And you have to do ethic clearance stuff, and you have to statistical analysis. That's just a lot of stuff. You don't have time to read up on all other aspects of the study of the human mind. Whereas if us philosophers have anything, we have time.
Oh
We're
yeah.
just sitting in a cafe and reading stuff. So I think we are in an absolutely like very, very fortunate position of being able to bring together two different strands of empirical sciences. So I think that that's one thing that philosophy can do very well, and I have been doing exactly that for decades.
Without the philosophy of mind forming over millennia, could we have even gotten to psychology as a hard and a soft science?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, psychology comes in various varieties, right? I mean, I'm not sure we should generalize.
Right. Well, I'm more talking about like the tradition of the Greek philosophy of mind, and then all the way up to people like Kant and the psychoanalysts like Freud and Jung and things like that. I mean, it seems like a linear thing to me that philosophy of mind and just philosophy in general underpins all that which we understand about psychology.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. But maybe. I mean, I think that some psychologists, they have very solid philosophical views and philosophical foundations. And that's actually one thing. I mean, if you're trying to work in this kind of interdisciplinary manner, that some people, some neuroscientists or psychologists, are going to be incredibly broad-minded, and they're going to be interested in any kind of philosophical questions, and they do their research because they're interested in this kind of big question issues. Some others are going to be much more interested in much more narrow things, and are not going to ask how that fits into everything else. So there are big differences, and maybe I was underselling philosophy a little bit here. I mean, I think that there's some, and also maybe just the whole general introspection stuff. I mean, I think that there's some. Sometimes some people can have really important insights in how the mind works that are not based on empirical sciences. I don't want to deny that, but the empirical sciences are there to verify or falsify that. So.
I trust neuroscience more than I trust just the general academic understanding what you would be taught in a university about the philosophy of mind. You know, I think obviously the way that we're going to understand human behavior ultimately will be neuroscience. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely, in the last 20 years, if you compare neuroscience as it was 20 years ago and as it is now, it's amazing, just the progress that they made. I mean, I think, I'm a big believer in neuroscience, and I've been relying on neuroscience in my work. I don't think philosophy is going to ever be replaced by neuroscience, because philosophy, and here's the kind of the third big thing that philosophy is doing. The reason why we have philosophy is because philosophy is talking about touchy-feely subjects that we really care about.
Yes.
Neuroscience doesn't really talk about touchy-feely things that we really care about. It's going to talk about what the visual cortex is doing, and I think what philosophy could be or should be doing is to bridge that gap, of the kind of the dry but incredibly precise and exact science on the one hand, the kind of phenomena that we really personally care about, like, I don't know, aesthetic experiences or free will or touchy-feely stuff.
Right. So how does aesthetics play into the interdisciplinary system that we've been talking about?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that aesthetics is of great interest to everyone. I don't know.
Oh yeah.
Was not interested in aesthetic because we all like music and we want to know why we like this piece of music and not the other piece of music. We all like films and not this film or that film. But then what's the difference? And I think in some ways, or the way I think about aesthetics is that aesthetics is the study of certain kind of special kind of experiences. So in that sense, aesthetics is going to be part of this interdisciplinary way of understanding the mind or the perceptual system or general, or more specifically. So that's the way I see the link between aesthetics and cognitive science or philosophy of mind.
Yeah.
But I understand that that's not everyone's understanding of aesthetics. So
no. I mean, aesthetics is the study of the nature of beauty and taste, and you can. I don't see how that directly correlates to neuroscience, but I mean, I can see. Well, no, go ahead. Explain that to me. What do you see about that?
I don't think it directly correlates to neuroscience. So I think that what there is of direct connections of aesthetics and neuroscience is not very strong. So especially around 25 years ago, people were just putting subject into scanners and asked them, "Oh, would you prefer this shape or that shape?"
Right.
And then checked what's going on in their brain. And I'm not sure that that's a very good approach.
No,
Uh,
that's anecdotal, right?
well, it's also just, what does it mean that you like this shape or that shape, and also it's a very unnatural
Mm,
setting in
mm.
which you're making aesthetic judgment. Also, is that going to guarantee that you have an aesthetic experience? I don't think so. You're just answering a
No.
question, like a test question, right?
Yes.
An aesthetic experience is kind of a special thing that's kind of difficult to just generate in a scanner. So there's a lot of issues there. But I think that there's an indirect way in which the empirical sciences of the mind can help us very much in understanding aesthetics. In the sense that I do kind of firmly believe that aesthetics is very deeply intertwined with philosophy of perception. So I wrote a book in 2016 called Aesthetics as Philosophy of Perception, where I argue that that we can really make huge progress in all debates about aesthetics if we take philosophy of perception seriously, or if we kind of use the conceptual apparatus of philosophy of perception. And
Are people
the
taking the
first question,
philosophy of perception? I'm sorry to interrupt you. Are
yeah,
people taking the philosophy of perception less seriously than they should?
philosophy of perception? No, I think philosophy of perception has a pretty good reputation. I actually think that people take aesthetics less seriously than they should.
Oh well, yeah, that's for
I
sure.
think I think in kind of academic philosophy, aesthetics has a pretty bad reputation. We can talk about that why, but
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I think that people just like many like philosophers are working on, I don't know, metaphysics or ethics or something like that. They often think of aestheticians as like this snobby people who just must spend their life, watching obscure films or reading obscure novels, and
Yeah.
they're just a bunch of snobs, and I think that's unfair, and that's not really what aesthetics is about. So I make a big distinction between aesthetics and philosophy of art.
Me
So
too.
philosophy of
Yeah.
art is about art. It's all kinds of approaches to art. So there's many metaphysical questions about art. What is an artwork? What is not an artwork? Is
What does it mean to be critical of something? What does it mean to be, like taking into account the creator of the art and their intention and the art and the enjoyer of the art, right?
exactly.
The
That's another
that
big thing.
criticism.
Yeah. How does
Yeah.
whether the artist fixes the meaning in the artwork and so on. So there's a bunch of
Right.
questions about art. Some metaphysical, what's a work of art? Some epistemic, how do we figure out the meaning of an art? Some political, what's the link between politics and art? That's a big thing. Some
Mm.
ethical, there's immoral art. Gauguin left his wife and kids and went off to Tahiti to paint underage girls who he slept with. Does that? Unfortunately, that's true. Does that
Yeah.
mean that his art is shit? Does it not mean that? Am I allowed to curse here?
You can say whatever you want, my friend.
Um, I'm still gonna try to. Maybe they're gonna censor this on YouTube or something.
You can say whatever the
This
fuck you
will be
want
on
to say.
YouTube. Yeah.
You can say whatever the fuck
Perry's
you want
right.
to say.
That's right. Perry's correct. No,
This
here
will be
we
on
try
YouTube.
to have like the good. What's that?
This won't be on YouTube or what?
Yeah, it will be on YouTube, but I mean, to be honest with you, my channel isn't huge yet. So it's not. It's not like so many people are going to be on here, be like, "Oh, he cussed," he cursed. No, it's nothing like that. But it will be up on my channel, and I'll share it with you when we put it up there, because I talked to Donald Hoffman. Have you ever met Donald Hoffman?
No. I know
Okay,
it.
so
I have,
he's another like you that believes in the intersection of all of these things. He's neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, all of that is what he studies. But he actually studies the way that we interact with reality phenomenologically. He thinks, well,
yeah.
anyway,
No, I know
yeah.
his work. I don't know his work.
Yeah, no, you just in general, you're more than welcome to stay as long as you want. You're more than welcome to say whatever you want. Don't feel pressured at all.
I like this general relaxed attitude very much. What are we talking about? Oh yeah, philosophy of art.
Yes, it's philosophy of art. Yes.
So that's philosophy of art. I think aesthetics is different from philosophy of art because aesthetics is not necessarily about art. There's a lot of aesthetic experiences that are not experiences of artworks. So we have aesthetic experiences of nature. We also have aesthetic experiences of everyday objects, like random arrangement of bottles on the dinner table, or the way the light hits the roof.
Right. Or looking at a sunset, right?
That would be natural beauty, but yeah, I mean, I think that's
Okay.
kind of a big example.
Yeah, you're talking about man-made created, right?
Yeah, so there's a very fine line between them. So there's a bunch of things that are going to be aesthetic experiences, but not experiences of artworks. Conversely, there's going to be a lot of experiences of artworks that are not aesthetic experiences. So when an art thief is going into the museum and steals a piece of art, I'm pretty sure that that person is not going to have an aesthetic experience while doing that. Or even an art dealer, right? An art dealer is going like, oh, should I buy this or should I buy that? And it's really not. I don't think it's an aesthetic experience. It's an experience that's very pragmatically motivated. Of how can I make more money?
Right.
Because of this, I think of aesthetics as being different from philosophy of art, and I think aesthetics itself is really a study of certain special kind of experiences, but it is just straightforwardly a kind of applied philosophy of perception in some ways. Given that philosophy of perception, like the rest of philosophy of mind, is ideally an interdisciplinary endeavor where we're going to somehow try to understand quirky features of the visual system or the perceptual system in general to understand what's so special about aesthetic experiences. So in this kind of indirect manner, I think the empirical sciences of the mind are relevant to understanding aesthetics. That was a very long answer to your question.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the appreciation of aesthetics is born from a physical mind, right? Physical brain, excuse me. Physical brain.
So that's exactly the kind of example that I think are very nice, and that's kind of the best case scenario for philosophy. When there's extremely touchy-feely stuff, like being moved by by a landscape or by a musical piece. And then to explain that in terms of the kind of hard, very precise, very exact sciences of the mind, that I think that's what every philosopher should be dreaming about. So to try to explain something complex in terms of something simple.
Yeah, the philosophy of mind directly relates to the philosophy of art too, because it's how you see yourself. It's how you take art, someone else's art, and allow it to identify your self reflection, and how you follow what I'm saying. You're like, yeah. What do you think about that?
So I think this is something that's been becoming kind of a theme in analytic aesthetics about how aesthetic engagement often tell us a lot about this ourselves. So I don't know whether this happened to any of you guys, but you listen or you read a book and somehow feel that you did not just find out about or did not just somehow have some kind of important insights about the historical period when the novel is set or something like that, or the characters, but somehow about yourself. Learn something about yourself, or you see yourself in a different light. See the people around you in a different light. Mm-hmm. And that's something that art can do that I think is going to have a big impact on how you're making sense of yourself in the world.
That is what music does for me, and a lot of my philosophy of music I take upon myself as a part of my self-identity.
There you go. Exactly.
And that's how it works. Let's see let me go back and look at my questions here, see if we got a good juicy one.
Oh, you have questions.
So tell us the main challenges and criticisms that you faced about bridging philosophy and empirical science. Obviously we talked a little bit about that, but have people really given you shit about this?
Less and less so, I would say. So when I started, it's a while ago, I'm old, and that was kind of a more unusual thing. So people were very often you presented an argument and of this kind, and people said, "Oh, but that's only an empirical question."
Ah.
Well, I'm thinking that there are the genuine philosophical questions, and then the kind of secondary, only empirical questions. But I think these days people think that the empirical findings about the mind, they very importantly constrain the what kind of philosophical theories we can give. I think that's a good thing. So I feel you're out of smoke here. Now that's vape.
Smoke as much as you want. That's why this is so informal. We don't want like structured, super professional, like Lex Friedman kind of talks. We want everyday kind of talks. You know what I mean? So
That's cool. That's
it's
nice.
just better this way, I think. I think we get to know each other and we get to understand each other's philosophy.
I agree. But I always
What were you saying?
I ask questions like this. I was talking about the only empirical question.
Yes.
So now these days people have, and I think there's very few people at this point who are just saying that, well, the empirical sciences are just completely irrelevant for philosophy, that we can just ignore them. But when I started, that was still an attitude. I think there's a kind of an extra kind of hurdle that is ahead of us, and that's kind of the dream would be to have kind of this bi-directional interaction between empirical sciences and philosophy. So at this point, I think what's happening is that the empirical sciences kind of constrain philosophical theories. So philosophy pays attention to what's going on in empirical sciences, and that's good. What would be even better is if the empirical sciences were paying attention to what philosophers have to say.
Good luck getting people to think that.
Well, I mean, I actually think, what I said before can go at least some of the way, when I said that what philosophers are good at is bringing together different sets of empirical findings. So I think that if if philosophy, let's say, combines neuroscience and psychology, then neuroscience have a reason to pay attention because there's some kind of interesting link between their stuff and psychology. And the psychologists have reason to pay attention because there's some kind of interesting link between their stuff and neuroscience. So I think it's and in this kind of dream of cognitive science and of interlinked disciplines to working together to understand the mind. That's that would be the end, the ideal solution.
That would be the ideal solution. I mean, if if you have empiricists, and if you talk about modern scientists, I would say that a lot of them probably have some kind of philosophical understanding of the philosophy of science, but I would say a lot of them, many of them, I would wager, follow a realist approach instead of an anti-real approach, right? And so they're going to be so empirical that the softness of psychology or the newness of neuroscience isn't necessarily going to play into their calculations when it probably should, right?
I see. Yeah, probably that. Yeah, that's probably the right kind of.
Well, I guess I'm really saying is empiricists, strict scientific empiricists, they need to be less, because I know the hard sciences are, we need to be as specific as possible, biology, physics, all that. But I mean, with a hard and soft science like psychology, I wish it was used more often to understand even the conceptual frameworks inside of the people's minds that construct this stuff.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, I mean, let me give you an example. I mean, I think I think that's exactly right what you're saying. So in psychology, people often use the kind of concepts and theories that they inherited from times when there was no neuroscience, for example. So one example would be object files. So the term of object files was used in perceptual psychology a lot. Starting from the early 80s. And the idea is that object files are what our perceptual system has. So this is clearly based on 80s office technology. When you have this little file, and then when you get every object that you see, every visual object that you see in your visual field, you open a little file for that object, and then as you learn more about the various features of that object, you put in kind of information in the file. So just as the police has a file for a criminal and then updates the file depending on new information coming in, your perceptual system opens a file for each object. So if I go and look in my fridge and I see that there's a big watermelon there, then I open a file for that object, and then later on I update that file with incoming information. If I cut it in half and I see that it's not red as I expected but yellow or whatever, so I update it.
Yeah,
everyone was talking about object files for like 20 years. And then in the meantime, of course, neuroscience has been born, and we learned a lot about how the visual system works. But psychologists were somehow they know about that stuff, but they still kept on using this very somewhat old-fashioned metaphor that is really based on somehow how the file is independent from the information in it.
It's based on like treating the brain like a computer, like in cognitive psychology specifically, right?
Yeah, I mean a version. Yeah, exactly, a version of that, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then and I think that one thing that us philosophers can do is to somehow help psychologists update or their metaphors, or get rid of conceptual apparatus or metaphorical ways of talking about the mind, which is outdated, for which we have new incoming information in neuroscience. I think that psychology is, in that sense, kind of needs philosophy to mediate between psychology and the other empirical disciplines.
Right. I don't think we could have psychotherapy without philosophy, because CBT involves dialectic behavioral therapy involves Hegelianism in a way. REBT, rational emotive behavioral therapy, includes Stoicism from Albert Ellis. So I mean, there's so many ways to tie philosophy into psychotherapy, and it's crazy to me. So I studied that a lot, at least.
Okay, I should say that I was talking about psychology as the academic discipline of trying to find out about the mind on the basis of timing and other kind of behavioral results, so not non-neuroimaging results. Now, psychotherapy, of course, that's a kind of entirely different issue, because there, I guess the idea is not to, the aim is not to understand the mind. The aim is to help people.
Right.
And there's, I can see how you can make an argument that somehow relies on something.
Well, I was just making a tangential kind of connection there. I do that. That's how I learn things. So.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, so there's also, you can make the connection that it presupposes some form of philosophical commitment.
I get the way that you were talking about it psychologically. I think I just jumped off tangentially. So.
And I mean, that's one way in which actually we, us people who are thinking about the mind can actually make a real contribution to the lives of. We can actually make people's lives better, and that's.
I mean, I have bipolar disorder, and so I've met with many psychiatrists and many psychotherapists in my last 10 years of living, and without the understandings, I think, of like developmental psychology, social psychology, behavioral psychology, all of it, we wouldn't have ways to treat me. I mean, I know pharmacologically we would, but I don't know if we would have ways to treat me without the underpinning of just psychology in general, underpinning the reasons for why psychotherapy works. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. So what kind of therapy did you do?
They're doing REBT with me. Mm-hmm. So I'm on 2 antipsychotics and an SSRI. And they use REBT with me. It works rather well. It's just I know a lot about this stuff. So doing it when you do that, you have trouble letting the therapy happen.
Oh, I see. Because how the wheels turn and how the
right. And we talk about it that way in my sessions. It's very interesting. We'll explain REBT to each other and start studying it and why it's a good method for what I'm dealing with. And it's just, I have a good psychotherapist, so I'm very thankful for that.
That's really crucial to find a person there's a connection.
Yeah, there is a connection. And that's why I care so much about psychology. I probably care the most about, cognitive psychology probably, and that's where neuroscience and cognitive psychology, and that's why I love talking to you so much about this. Mm-hmm. But I can't agree any more about the interdisciplinary need of it. Let me go to find another good question here. Let's see.
I mean, just to because you're sharing this with us, and I think that's
go ahead.
And very important, and I'm glad to hear that you're doing well. I mean, I think that one way. One thing that's really important and crucial about psychotherapy is that or many versions of psychotherapy. Sorry.
That's okay.
Is that it works even if you don't believe in it, right? So it's not like a kind of voodoo thing that you need to somehow have your own philosophy, right, in order for it to work. It's
right, like you're dealing with a psychoanalyst with his own internal philosophy every single time. Yeah, I got you.
Yeah, exactly. So it's great that you're back on track.
It is. I recommend everybody listening go to psychotherapy. See what you can find out about yourself. I think it's
Especially
healthy
now,
for
yeah.
everyone.
After the pandemic, it seems like the mental health issue is really really serious.
Depression is extremely on the rise, and so is anxiety
Everything is on
disorders.
the rise.
Yeah,
Everything
all
is
of
on
this because the interconnectivity of the internet and the more understanding that we have of the mind. What else was I had a really good question in my brain a second ago, and we got off on the tangent, which I love. I love tangents.
Okay.
So how can we? All right. So how can we tie this into art education?
Art education.
Yeah, like
Creating
what
art.
what are the implications of connecting all these fields interdisciplinarily? Does it have a significant? Can it have a significant impact on like art education or design or things like that? That makes sense.
I don't know. I mean, I feel that one big thing in art education is creativity, and there's been a lot of work, again, very interdisciplinary work about creativity, and we really know a lot about creativity at this point. And I think that on the basis of that, I think that's going to be a pretty important thing for any art schools to look into how creativity works.
The reason I ask this is because it's the weakest of all of them. You know what I mean? And like you can have really good cognitive psychology education, but how do we have understanding the philosophy of mind? And the philosophy of art? How do we have good art education? I guess we have some beautiful universities that have great art education, but I don't know how we would share that with the general populace other than having talks like this.
So, I mean, that's like a giant question, right? About how art is taught, whether it can be taught. Some people thought that no, it's like you're just born with a talent. I don't think that's really right.
So we're not born with artistic creativity. We can cultivate it.
I mean, I'm sure that we're born with something, but I'm also sure that it's not the end of the story, right? That you can improve, and and if you don't do anything for your artistic talents, then you're not gonna be very successful. And that's what art schools are for, right? I mean, if that were not the case, then art schools would be out of business, and they're not. So, but let me get back to the creativity thing, because I think that in many ways that's something that's really important for all kinds of. I mean, there's artistic creativity, but also scientific creativity or philosophical creativity. This is something that we all care about, and even if you're not in neither of these kind of very I don't know, touchy-feely disciplines, even if you are working as an accountant or something, there's still a lot of creativity that you can use. So that's something that we really should understand, how we can be more creative, how can we think outside the box, because we're going to be better employees, we're going to be better philosophers, we're going to be better artists, and so on. And there's one important connection with creativity that's coming out of a lot of research now, and that's the connection with attention. It's very difficult to be creative if your attention is sucked up elsewhere.
Yes.
So one study where we were talking about art education. So this is from an art education context. This experiment. So this was done somewhere in Australia, and the setup is that students in art education, they had to write an essay about the number 30. And then there were two conditions. In one condition, they before they had to do that, they had to do this extremely difficult matching task. And in the other one, they didn't have to do anything before that. So in one case, their attentional resources were depleted, and the other one, they weren't. And then these essays were graded both for creativity and for mathematical exactness. And for mathematical exactness, there was no difference between the two groups. So your attentional load did not make any difference there. But for creativity, it made a huge difference. And there's a bunch of experiments. But if while you're writing your essay or you're creating music or something like that, there's some kind of attentional drain on you, then the work is going to be much less creative. So attention is the kind of resource that's really needed for creativity.
Is it like it was 7 or 8 things we can hold in our conscious experience at one time, right? Our attention can be focused on that many things for a regular, average human being. I mean, excuse me.
Yeah, there's this first experiment when you have to kind of follow little circles on the screen, and there's a max number that you can follow. So there's a
Yeah.
and that's a famous demonstration of attentional bottleneck that is just that you can't pay attention to everything all the time.
Yep.
You're always selecting for a limited number of things that you're paying attention, and if your attention is devoted to other tasks, less attention is going to remain for
What about
for
the unconscious processing? You know what I mean?
all
Like
of
all
it.
the
Yeah,
stuff that are we taking in all of that information and just blocking it out?
super important question. So attention, and this is not something that's you know, if unless you are really into the empirical literature about attention, you wouldn't know that. But attention can be conscious or unconscious. And there's this really cool experiment that I'm going to talk about in some details from 2012 that shows this, that attention does not have to be conscious. Attention also works as an unconscious filter. So attention is this: you have to focus your eyes in the middle of the screen, which is the case for like 90% of vision study experiments. So you're looking here, and then in this corner of your screen, they flash a naked lady really quickly. So you're not aware of that. Again, very, very quickly. And in other situation, you flash the naked lady here or here or here. And then, so again, you're not aware of that. And then what you are being told is that what you're going to have to do is to have to recognize certain objects that are flashed in one of the corners. So they're going to be, watering cans or sheep or cars and so on. And
Right.
so what's happening is that so what the subject is aware of is that they're looking at the screen, the fixation point in the middle, and then they flash a truck here, and then you have to push the button as soon as you recognize that, and they're going to be much quicker pushing the button if previously the naked lady was presented in that corner. So the idea is that your attention, unconscious attention, is drawn there by the naked lady. You have no idea that happened, and your attention still lingers there, and that's what makes it quicker.
No, so it doesn't matter if it was a naked lady the second time.
There's only one naked lady, so they present a naked lady briefly, and then a neutral object. And
Gotcha. That's kind of what I meant. Yeah.
yeah. And what's really beautiful about this is that works for heterosexual men. It works much less well for homosexual men and for heterosexual
Like me.
women. There you go. And for heterosexual women. So that shows that it's not just that there's some kind of stimulus, but the actual content of that stimulus that again is unconsciously presented it does matter. So the unconscious attention was drawn there, and that's what made you recognize the thing more quickly. So this shows that attention can be conscious or unconscious. So I think it's a really important thing to know.
I didn't think about it that way until you mentioned it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so to kind of connect it back to your bipolar stuff.
Please.
One thing. So one hypothesis about what the hell is going on today, that everyone is breaking down in all kinds of mental health issues, is exactly the importance of attention. So because if our attention, because attention is a limited resource, right? If your mind is constantly using up attention, because of the social media use, or because we have some kind of trauma that we have to constantly hide from each other.
So we've got a limited amount of bandwidth, basically, is what you're saying.
Exactly. So that's used up, and there's no attention is going to remain for anything else. For example, to resist addiction stuff, right? Addiction is a real issue these days, right? And the reason why people are falling into that is because in order to not get addicted, you need some kind of attentional freedom, and you don't really get that if for example, if you have traumas. So yeah, maybe just one more word. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I talk too much. You go.
No, you talk. I love listening to you. This is what I'm interested in. So I didn't know that attention could be unconscious like that. So are we taking in things like what my air conditioner is doing right now. I'm now moving that to my actual focus. But was I aware of that? Was my mind aware of that, like experientially, in my unconscious attention a
Yeah,
moment
so
ago?
that's a big that's a big debate. And the idea is that, I mean, I think that the least controversial idea is that it was part of your experience, but it was represented in a much more indeterminate manner. And
Hmm.
when you're attending to it, you're making it more determinate. So, for example, when you before that you were somehow vaguely aware that that your fridge is there in the room, but you were not very much representing the exact shape or the color of the handle or stuff like that. But when you're attending to it, then you do something. Then you do that. So
It's
attention, what it
interesting.
does is it increases the determinacy of representation, which makes sense, right? Because we're attending to things when we want to do something with them. And for them, we have to represent the various features in great determinacy.
That's interesting. How do you mean about determinism now? Can you explain that in the way that you mean
Determinacy,
it?
not determinism. Determinism is the opposite of free will. It's determinacy. So,
Oh, yeah, yeah. That's what I thought you meant. I just didn't know if you were using a terminology that I wasn't familiar with.
I mean, so we can represent things in more or less determinate manner. So if I'm looking at the one of these Discord logos of some of the audience members, and I represent it as being a certain shade of yellow. I can do it in various levels of determinacy. I can represent it as yellow. I can represent it as, I don't know, ochre, which is supposed to be like a
Yeah.
specific shade of yellow, or I can represent it as the exact, like, very specific shade of ochre 00123.
Yeah, you could. Yeah.
That would be the maximally determinate or very, very determinate way of representing it. And it goes all the way up. So that's kind of hierarchy of all kinds of properties depending on how determinate they are. And
Yeah.
what attention does is increase the determinacy.
Okay. So it increases the determinacy, or you said determinate, not determinacy, right?
It makes the property more determinate, right? So when you're oops,
You're all
you
right.
back?
Yeah.
And my computer somehow fell.
That was weird. No, go ahead. You're fine.
So the so it makes the represented property more determinate. So when I see a yellow patch in my peripheral vision, right there, I'm not paying attention to it. I'm not really interested in what's going on there. Then I represent it maybe just as color, as having some kind of color or has some kind of light color. But when I'm attending to it and attending to the color itself, then then I'm going to represent it as having a much more specific color. It also
Ah.
works for kind of imagining or imagination or imagery, which is the big thing that I've been working on, or I had worked on. And so, for example, when I ask you to remember the childhood home where you grew up, and I ask you to visualize the color of the tap in the bathroom, you could do that, right? And then I ask you to shift your attention to the shape of the sink in the same bathroom, then you could do that as well. But in these two imaginative episodes, when you were attending to the tap or when you were attending to the shape of the sink, the other property was much less determinately represented than the one that you were attending to.
Right.
So you
I
have
get
this
that.
kind of determinacy economy of.
What? Well, and I get that. I understand it now. What? I know what imagination is in the way that I represent it as a module in my mind, but what is imagination? Because you said imaginative. What is imagination? How does it play into all this interdisciplinariness? Is it a part of creativity, like you said, or is it something different?
A lot of people, they connect creativity with imagination, but it's kind of a controversial topic. Well, I can tell you, people make a distinction between two different kinds of imagination. So you can have sensory imagination when you imagine seeing something or hearing something or smelling something, and that's basically some kind of simulated perceptual episode, something like that. But you also have what people call propositional imagination, which means that you imagine that something is the case. So imagining that Paris is the capital of Italy would be propositional imagination. Imagining the Eiffel Tower from across the river would be sensory imagination.
Gotcha.
So what I'm really interested in is neither of those two things, is mental imagery, which is really just a perceptual representation that's not directly triggered by external input. And I think that mental imagery is really the kind of the crucial concept in understanding all of these kind of imaginative phenomena.
Okay.
And that's what I wrote this big book about.
That's the book, huh?
Yep.
You can expound on that if you'd like. It's up to you. I mean, that's extremely interesting. I love talking about imagination. So,
What interests you about imagination?
the fact that we have it all in evolution, the fact, I guess, that we needed it to get over the next hill, and find new food and try new things, inventions, things like this. It's just impressive to me that evolution could instantiate something so beautiful as imaginative qualities.
Yeah, but I think that's a big challenge as well to try to understand what it is. I mean, this kind of imagination, or some people call it counterfactual thinking, is incredibly expensive, right? It's like this. Evolutionary speaking, it's a very complex mental feature, and it must have had some kind of selective pressure to get us there, right? And it's unclear what it is. And I have one line that kind of traces it back to various uses of mental imagery. So I think mental imagery was very important in evolution. So if you see a lion, that's very important because you have to run away. If you see the lion's tail sticking out of the bush, it's as important. So this is called in perceptual psychology. It's called amodal completion when you are representing an occluded part of a perceived object.
Yeah, you're perceiving the part that you're not seeing, right? Or
Exactly.
you're constructing it mentally.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
right now you see my torso, but you somehow you're perceptually
Right.
representing what's here, but that's not, you don't receive any kind of stimulus from there, right? I mean, you're only getting this. So your perceptual system represents that part of me, or represents the rest of my hand, the tips of my finger, but it's not based on actual stimulus, the actual input. So that's one way in which you can see that that's mental imagery. That's perceptual representation that's not directly triggered by sensory.
So that mental perception, mental imagery. Excuse me. That mental imagery is what imagination is doing.
Well, that's one use. So imagination is one use of this kind of mental imagery. But the aim.
Oh, that's right. You said it was. Yeah, I got you now.
So an amodal completion is another way in which mental imagery is used, and in amodal completion, I think is incredibly useful evolutionarily. Right? Again, seeing just one part of the lion and the rest of them is occluded behind the bush is as selectively important as
Take your time.
no, I just saw that there's some questions.
Oh yeah, definitely. If you wanna answer any of those, you're more than welcome to.
Let me just finish this. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, amodal completion.
Yeah, mental imagery and imagination.
Yeah. So that has like a direct evolutionary purpose, and I think that you could kind of put together an argument where all of the other kind of imaginative abilities, they kind of piggyback on this more evolutionarily established stuff.
I gotcha.
Shall we look at some questions?
Yeah, you can. You absolutely can. You're more than welcome to stay as long as you want to. We've been talking for an hour, so I'm going to open it up to the floor. Perry, did you want to go first, and then we'll let Tree, because I think she had a question.
Yeah, I've had a few questions pop up during the conversation, but for the sake of everyone getting their questions in, perhaps I'll keep it to what we're talking about here with mental imagery.
Do two, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so we'll see how this one goes. In terms of understanding knowledge and truth, assuming that those are such things, empirical science is a great way to understand what gravity is, what these objects in front of me are, how they act within, quote, reality. I've always wondered and pose this question to many people. Can mental imagery, or perhaps imagination in a broad sense, help us understand certain phenomena and concepts and, certain things that empirical science just, they can't prove the same way that we can, just for the sake that it's not repeatable. We can take things like the Big Bang, for example, our origins. Can imagination in certain thought experiments or hypotheticals give the same valence of falsifiability, perhaps, if we put these thought experiments and imagination in certain ways? Can they be trusted? And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, or if that was coherent enough of a question.
Absolutely, that's a very good question. So the first thing I want to say is that there's people. So very often when people talk about what it is that sets philosophy apart from the empirical sciences, they say, well, the empirical sciences are about the actual, and philosophy is about, I don't know, the potential or the necessary sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But it's and I think that that's kind of a wrong. I'm not sure that that's the right kind of opposition, because very often the empirical sciences are not only about the actual and what very often they are about, necessities, or they're very often about the range of possibilities in certain scientific scenario, especially in theoretical physics. But and it's also not true that philosophy is only about the possible or the necessary. I think philosophy is in many ways about the actual, and the reason why we care about philosophy is because it has some kind of real personal import to us, and that's as actual as it gets.
Like a representation to the real.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. But I think that's what the kind of the second half of your question about how maybe you can use imagination or imagery in order to figure stuff out in philosophy in a way that's somehow not available to the empirical scientists. That's a very good question. Again, I might not put it in terms of what philosophy is doing and what empirical sciences are doing, but maybe just the general endeavor of trying to understand the world. I think it's very important that it's not always just about the actual that needs to be understood, but also about what's possible and what's not. And here, imagination or imagery is going to be an important thing, with one big, huge kind of warning sign, and that's about how imagery is by definition cut off from the world.
Yeah.
Right. So it's defined as a perceptual representation that's not directly triggered by the external input.
So a priori.
It's not a priori. It can be very much so. So here's one example of mental imagery. You watch the TV muted, right? You watch the TV muted, and you watch someone who you have seen before. I don't know, Barack Obama, and you hear Obama's distinctive tone of voice. That's imagery in your auditory sense modality, but it's not directly triggered by your auditory input. It's triggered by the visual input. So there's this one link. That's only happening in your head. There's no kind of actual causal link reading there. And it's the same is true for imagination. So it's always going to be a danger of unreliability when it comes to imagery or imagination.
Right. Always got to have a little bit of skepticism and whatnot.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Go
I
ahead,
appreciate
Jerry. Did you have another one? If you don't, I'll move on. It's up to you.
Well, let's loop back to me. I'd rather give my time to other people, and if we still have sufficient time, perhaps I'll ask another one or two. But
well, it's up to Bence. He can leave, or he can request to go anytime he needs to. But let's get Tree in here real quick and see what Tree's got to say.
Hi. Yeah, your talk is incredibly interesting. I totally am excited to read your book. Especially since I have aphantasia, which is the inability to create mental images. So I'm especially interested because, like, when you're in the minority, right, you really have to understand the majority very well, because if you're communicating with other people, you have to be able to effectively represent what you're saying. And I'm really interested in, especially there's a thing I noticed that I was able to take photographs effectively because I know I like what I saw. but I cannot create mental images, right? Which is a separate thing. And I wonder if you do have different categories of mental imagery that you're describing that kind of account for that ability to do both, like what you're seeing, because you're not paying attention to the whole of what you're seeing at any given one time, right? So there must be some ability to interpret what's happening inside the brain there as two separate things.
So super exciting stuff. So I've been giving talks about mental imagery for almost a decade now, and there's always some people in the audience who have aphantasia, and it's always fascinating to talk to these people. Can I ask whether you dream, whether you remember you dream visual images?
Yes, and there are ways to get my brain to see images in more detail. Like if I've got a migraine and if I put pressure on my eye, I can see really detailed images. Or if and also there's also two different parts of the thing where I have like no visual image, right? No like internal representation in detail, but a lot of detail in terms of the story about the image.
Right.
Which can be useful, but also it can recognize faces as well.
That's interesting.
So maybe I should say a little bit to the other people about aphantasia. So aphantasia is a relatively new thing or newly named thing that some people they report not having any mental imagery. So you close your eyes, you visualize an apple. Then for most people, some kind of image of an apple is going to come up that's somewhat similar to actually seeing an apple. For those people who we categorize as aphantasics, there's no image of an apple at all. And one thing that you should need to notice is that this is a behavioral criterion for identifying aphantasia. So you fill out a questionnaire. It's called VVIQ, and then on the basis of your answers, you're gonna qualify as aphantasia or hyperphantasia or something. Hyperphantasia is the opposite of aphantasia. So then you have extremely vivid mental imagery. Most of us are somewhere in between. So some people have no imagery, some people have very vivid imagery. Most of us have somewhere in between. So because of this is a behavioral criteria, it just means that if you say that you're trying to conjure up an image of an apple and didn't succeed, that's all there is that we know about people who will all count as aphantasia. But it's not a monolithic phenomenon. It's a completely diverse thing that can have very diverse causes. And because a lot of things need to come together in order for you to intentionally and voluntarily conjure up mental imagery, many of those things can go wrong, and depending on what goes wrong, it's going to be a very different kind of aphantasia. So my guess would be that in your case, the issue is with the voluntary control of imagery.
Yes.
That is the most frequent form of aphantasia. So these people do have imagery. Very often they even have flashbacks of imagery. I don't know whether you have any flashbacks ever or...
Not really, no.
What happens.
No flashbacks, huh?
And then you can induce visual imagery with the help of other sense modalities, so auditory means. But the problem is with the control. For some other people, the problem is not with voluntary control. It's with just with mental imagery in general. And I published a fair amount on this, and I think that one form of aphantasia at least can be explained in terms of unconscious mental imagery. So the idea is that at least some aphantasia subjects, they do have imagery, but it's unconscious imagery, so they don't report it, or they report that they don't have any. Before, we've seen that attention can be conscious or unconscious, perception can be conscious or unconscious, and mental imagery can also be unconscious.
Oh, okay. So those three categories are all...
In some cases of aphantasia. I'm not saying that in all kinds of aphantasia, but in some cases of aphantasia.
Yeah.
I want to also say, and I think that few people know this, especially aphantasia people, and you really should know this, aphantasia, you might think it's a bad thing. It's a good thing. So we know a lot about the connections between mental imagery and various mental health issues. If you have vivid mental imagery, you're much more prone to a number of psychological issues. Already, depression is deeply connected to mental imagery, and it's the lack of a positive future imagery. PTSD is obviously all about imagery. Various trauma stuff. And if you're having aphantasia, it's going to be much less likely that you have any kind of issues with mental health problems.
Yeah, so your emotional regulation is probably much better than mine.
Unfortunately, not so much. But
I'm not saying that that's a guarantee that there's going to be noise, but it's one factor, right?
So I'm really interested in particular is not so. I mean, more I'm interested in is the idea of how art is perceived by people who have different neurodivergences, right? I have a friend who tells me that he never pays attention to the color or art in videos, that he treats almost every video as if it's like a podcast, right? And I believe that there's something, like, obviously there's honesty to what he's saying, that on a conscious level that's happening. And he admits that it might be something happening subconsciously. But I wonder to what degree people can experience an art without knowing, or as well, how does their peculiar brain impact upon their experience of art?
Yeah, so there's some research on it, not as much as I would like that to be, and also some of it is not really about neurotypical, not neurotypical. I think that your previous exposure to various things have a huge impact on how you look at art or how you see art. So and we have a fairly good understanding of how that works. So there's this phenomenon called perceptual learning. So perceptual learning means that what you see now depends in many ways on what you have seen before. One important and very impressive form of that is the mere exposure effect. When just merely exposed to a certain kind of stimulus is going to make you like that stimulus better. I'm happy to talk about it, but maybe it's not that, the details are not that important. And I think that has a huge impact on how you look at art. Basically, what kind of things you have looked at before. Not just what kind of artworks you looked at before, what kind of natural features you looked at before. And that's actually one big project that I'm working on. But thankfully, it's a deadline that's far away, so I still have some time. It's about the cross-cultural variations in our aesthetic engagement. So depending on your cultural background, and not just your background in what kind of art you have consumed, but your general background about what kind of objects you're surrounded by and so on, has a huge impact on how you're going to perceive artwork. So we can't generalize about how us Americans, Western Europeans look at art. You can't generalize from that to how people from other parts of the world look at the very same artwork, because they will see something very different from what we see. They have a very different kind of visual experience from the kind of visual experience that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Is this what you were asking, or does this answer your question?
Because I'm wondering now if, say, rural areas tend to have a vastly different politics to city areas, right? Yeah. And if you can draw some sort of relationship or of some sort of similar idea between the aesthetic styles used in film, right, and the audience that it appeals to, right? And could you make some sort of relationship there between the politics expressed and the art style used, or something like that, to validate that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think politics is just incredibly complex, and it depends on all kinds of things that have nothing to do with perception. It has to do with other stuff, and I feel that might be a stretch, or maybe to have a kind of a full explanation. It's, but I think for sure we can explain kind of aesthetic diversity in terms of perceptual diversity. I'm not sure about political diversity.
But just the rural-city divide even. Would you say that applies there?
I mean, so that's definitely a big perceptual difference, right? I mean, whether you grew up looking at skyscrapers or you grew up looking at cornfields, it's just a very different kind of stimulus set. And depending on that, very different things are going to appeal to you. Now, these days, of course, I mean, most of us much of what we see are various content on our screens, right? So in some sense, there's, at least in the so-called Western world, there's more of a kind of a push in a more unified direction. So there's going to be less diversity because of this, right? Because we all watch, I don't know, of Stranger Things and Seinfeld, right? And because of that, there's a certain commonality in what we have perceived, and because of that, there's going to be a commonality in what kind of artwork we're sensitive to. But we should again not get too far, because there's still going to be a lot of outside Western Europe, North America. There's going to be a lot of communities where they're exposed to very different kind of stimuli, and they're going to interact with artworks very differently as a result.
Yeah, I think each individual's interpretation, hermeneutical interpretation of the art, is beautiful. That it's all that it's all based on the individual. But certain groups and cultures have such a close representation of what they think art is that it all seems to cohesively say, in Western film, like everyone understands that 2001: A Space Odyssey is better than Miami Vice. You know what I mean? Or something. I don't know. Pick another movie. Pick a Transformers or something like that. Right? How do those things come about?
So I might be an outlier, but I don't actually really think that that's true.
Okay.
That this 2001: Space Odyssey is better than Miami Vice.
Well, I was not me personally, but if you go to Rotten Tomatoes, or if you go to these places that have quote unquote professional critics, they think these things. So
yeah, I mean, it's not. I'm not trying to defend Miami Vice here or anything. 2001: Space Odyssey, but I feel that all of these claims can only be given kind of from a certain cultural perspective. So if you have grown up watching certain kind of films, then yeah, you should like 2001: Space Odyssey more than Miami Vice. But if you had a completely different kind of perceptual / aesthetic background, and you might what would be more reasonable is to go the other way around. That Miami Vice is better than 2001: Space Odyssey. So in general, I think in aesthetics we should be very non-arrogant and not kind of lecture others about what they should like and what they shouldn't like, because I think that much of our aesthetic judgments, aesthetic experiences are going to be heavily influenced by our perceptual history. Just because I have a certain kind of perceptual history doesn't mean that you have that kind of perceptual history, and it doesn't mean that you should somehow you will or you should like those kinds of works. So
I agree with you. Yeah,
I feel that aesthetic humility is an important thing, that we should be all non-judgmental about other people's aesthetic taste and also about our own aesthetic taste.
Yeah, I mean, less judgmental all around.
Exactly.
Let me circle back, Tree, real quick to Perry. Go ahead, Perry. Did you have?
So
I heard you pipe up there.
I am a moral anti-realist, tentatively. Yet, I really care a lot about morality and ethics within the domain of my interpretation of my philosophy and philosophy of others. We were talking about kind of bridging the gap between philosophy and empirical science, for example.
Yeah.
I wonder what your thoughts are, maybe generally just speaking, on morality in general. If it's something that you think about a lot in your everyday life or in your philosophy, in your studies, in your book. What amount of mental stock or mental energy do you put forth towards morality when you go about your philosophical endeavors? So
I try to keep a safe distance from ethics and moral philosophy. Everyone hates moral professors, right? No, good place. No, moral philosophy. Right. Because I think, I don't know. I'm not sure why. I feel there's a certain kind of uniformity in moral philosophy that might not be a very healthy thing. For example, like you said that you're an anti-realist about morality. I think that's kind of very few people are anti-realists. I could count it on one hand how many people are kind of card-carrying anti-realists in moral philosophy. But maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm just not that interested in morality. One thing that kind of annoys me if they connect aesthetics and ethics, or they kind of think of aesthetics in moral philosophy terms, because I think the two are very different.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I don't know if we can treat aesthetics in moral propositional terms. I don't think very much of ethics either, except for the fact that I understand normativity and things like that. So that's why I don't immediately jump into it, is because it is all normative. It is all prescription. Real quick, let me. How much longer do we have you for? We don't want to keep you too.
It's getting dark here, so
Yeah.
Maybe 5 more minutes. Is that good?
Okay. Yeah. One more question. Tree, you look. Yeah, I don't want to exclude anybody, so let me look in the chat real quick and see if somebody had a question. Open the chat.
I do.
You do, Nivik? Okay, go ahead, Nivik.
I'm kind of curious between the relationship with art and science, and with art, you can see that when it's used, like in language, people can be very artistic in their expression in language. It seems like there's a relationship there, and they're being logical in their in language as well. And I'm not really sure this, like, what art is, like, why the significance of it is, why it's important, and what are your thoughts when it comes to art and science, the relationship there?
So it's interesting because art and science, in many ways, I mean, one kind of stereotypical thought is that they're kind of opposite ends of the human endeavor, right? I mean, art is as soft as it gets, and science is as hard as it gets, and it's different ends of the kind of uniquely human things that we do. But in some ways, there's a lot of commonalities, and one of them is something that we already talked about a little bit, and that's creativity, right? Creativity is absolutely key, both in science and in art, and that really makes me and also lots of other people think that that's something really very similar about art and science. When the kind of creativity that goes into the creation of some really inventive musical piece is in some ways very similar to the kind of creativity that goes into the creation of a new theory of
relativity. Relativity
Exactly.
had to include some creativity, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I feel that that we should appreciate that connection. So I'm happy that you asked that question. I don't think that's something that a lot of people have explored, this connection, and part of that is because these are kind of opposite ends of philosophy, right? I mean, philosophy of science has no patience whatsoever for philosophy of art, and philosophers of art usually they don't really own up on philosophy of science. And we talked about how it would be a good thing for the different disciplines in cognitive science to have more interaction between them, between psychology and neuroscience and philosophy. I think it would also be good to have more interaction between different philosophical disciplines. So have, philosophers of science take philosophy of art more seriously, or the other way around.
I agree.
Yeah, it's like when your mind is, I think, free in an artistic way, it could open you up to different views. When it comes to reasoning,
One more, Nivik, and we gotta let him go. Okay.
Yeah, like art, like with religion, art. It seems like art can kind of being very, very artistic and expressive. It can push back against people who are religious in their thinking and have their minds be more.
This is on Nivik's mind all the time, Bence.
And atheism and kind of push against religion and stuff like that. Yeah. I mean, it goes both ways, right? I mean, religious art was a big, huge thing for a long time. I think a lot of art is very kind of explicitly against religion. I mean, I feel that one thing that both art can be very good at is, and also philosophy can be very good at, is to foster some kind of free and unconstrained thinking, of questioning all assumptions. that we have taken for granted in the past, and then we can now actually. It's my phone.
That's okay.
You can question those, and I think that general attitude very often goes against religion, or can go against religion. So so I feel
That's a good answer.
against some form of religion. But because, of course, some other forms of religion can also be very, very much questioning or authoritative, or questioning at least some kind of assignments. Someone really wants to comment.
That's okay. How about we let you go and you get the call?
Yeah, maybe that's a good point to end on. That.
Yeah, we love you for coming so much. I love talking to you. Thank you so much. You're more than welcome to come back anytime you want.
Thanks, Bence. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. That was fun.
Thank you, my friend. Have a good one. Ciao.
You too.